Well, welcome everyone to the Fall Literary Arts Lab at the University of Chicago. I think I probably know everyone here, but I'm Srikanth Reddy. My nickname's Chiku. And I'm the interim director of creative writing at the university and a poet on faculty in the English department, creative writing. Very excited about this season's literary festival on the University of Chicago campus. This is kind of a new thing that we're doing, bringing together important voices in contemporary fiction, nonfiction, translation, poetry, and emerging genres. Because everybody loves a literary festival, we're going to do it again this spring on campus. In April of this year, we'll have our spring Literary Arts Lab. Don't worry, it's just a festival. We're calling it a lab to sound fancy pants. So please join us not just for tonight, but for all 3 days of this celebration of the literary arts on campus. We have events tomorrow and Saturday at noon, 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. So it's easy to remember. We kind of schedule, it's like a layer cake of literature. At noon, we'll have craft talks by our visitors. At 4 o'clock, we'll have panels and conversations with our visitors and University of Chicago faculty and creative writing faculty in English and creative writing. And in the evening, we'll get our party on with readings, and all of these events are in the Logan Performance Penthouse. Thanks to the festival organizers, Suzanne Buffum, Vu Tran, Ling Ma, and the indefatigable Starsha Gill. And thank you to the Kestenbaum family, whose generosity toward creative writing for many years now has made possible our major endowed fiction event each year, and in particular tonight's event with John Keene, who I'm incredibly excited to have here. So thanks for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow and Saturday at noon, 4 and 6 p.m. For more time with some of the most exciting writers at work today. And now, because everybody loves an introduction to another introduction, let me welcome Julie Irumwanya, my colleague, to the podium to introduce tonight's reader.
When I first encountered the work of John Keene, I was still a graduate student. Reading Annotations, his first book, was like feeling my way through a dark cave. I couldn't rely on common ways of seeing. The text required my senses to be sharply attuned to the syntax of the line, the textures and layers of meaning in a word, and those conscious and unconscious associations both on the page and off. In short, I felt put to work. Keene's writing doesn't coddle readers. His work challenges you to go beyond simply being conscious or woke to remembering you're alive. Annotations is narrowly described as a novel by most critics, but it is so much more, a bridge between the novel, the memoir, and the lyric poem, all genres that Keene masterfully deploys. Keene reappropriates master narratives and styles to destabilize not only our senses and sensibilities, but also how we encounter ourselves, who we are and who we think we are. And if, in facing ourselves, we are troubled by what we see, Keene's work, rather than remaining transfixed by its own image, urges us to translate our longing, our agony, our hunger, our sorrow, our humanness into something greater. Keene's scope, prescience, and clarity of vision are a hallmark of all of his work. In his poetry collection, Punks, intimate gestures contain multitudes. The line invites the reader to engage the vast world through haunting, lyrical, and kinetic imagery. The New York Times describes his counter-narratives as a rare book of short fiction with an epic intuition of time. In his collaging of letters, song lyrics, newspaper articles, maps, scholarly tomes, and historical documents, Keene masters the master narrative. In 2018, when he was awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant, the MacArthur Foundation said this of his work: through innovations in language and form, he imbues with multifaceted subjectivities those who have been denied nuanced histories within the story of America, and exposes the social structures that confine, enslave, or destroy them. In addition to his fiction and poetry, Keene has published numerous essays, translations, and collaborations with artists. A graduate of Harvard and New York University's MFA in Creative Writing Program, Keene is a distinguished professor of English and African American Studies at Rutgers University, Newark, where he also chairs the Department of African American and African Studies, and he also teaches creative writing in the MFA program. In addition to his MacArthur Genius Award, he has also been honored with the Lannan Literary Award for Fiction, the American Book Award, the Lambda Literary Award, the Whiting Award, and the Wyndham Campbell Prize in Fiction. He is also a member of the Darkroom Writers Collective, a fellow of Cave Canem, and a member of the Planning Organizational Committee and Jury of the African Poetry Book Series. It is with great honor that I welcome our Kessenbaum writer, John Keene.
So good evening. I should say it's almost kind of surreal to be here because when I was in high school, one of the schools that I considered applying to and attending was the University of Chicago. That didn't happen, but my father and I actually came up to Chicago and we took a little tour and we both thought, oh, this looks like such a beautiful university. So all these years later, here I am. I want to thank Julie Iromwanya, the Committee on Creative Writing, Chiku Reddy, Suzanne Buffum, Vu Tran, Ling Ma, Jen Scapitoni, all the other creative writing and English faculty, staff, and students, and Starsha Gill, who are incredibly patient, thank you, and everyone else at the University of Chicago who was involved in making it possible for me to be here tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm actually going to read, I was asking Julie, should I read a story set during the Civil War, or should I read a story about two modernist poets? And so she said, I think she said she's going to ask me a question about the second story, so I'll read that story. So this story is called Blues, and I will say you'll be able to pick up the point of view. It shifts constantly, but it involves, the two main figures are the poet Langston Hughes and the great Mexican modernist poet Javier Villaurrutia. And the interesting thing to me, one of the interesting things to me was Villaurrutia has this poem called North Carolina Blues, which is quite different from many of his other poems, and he actually treats racism and racial oppression in the poem directly. And then at the very end of the poem, so he even has a scene, image of a black man being lynched. And then at the very end of the poem, he has this set of erotic lines that seem to just come out of nowhere, and he dedicates the poem to Langston Hughes. So one of the translators of Villaurrutia said, and you know, one time they drove down to North Carolina and maybe they had a relationship. And I was like, I think you just made that up. So anyway, but I said, then I said, I will make this up. So, Blues. He wanted to say something, but the English words at first eluded him. When they met earlier that year at a secret party after the dinner given by Rafael Lozano at the German director Augustin's, the noted poet had been staying briefly in Mexico. Even before then, a few of them had shared his poems like talismans, reading them as if their lives depended on it. He had translated 3 and published them in a local journal. The older poets had already dismissed this so-called literature, condemned it, much like their peers in Harlem. All this pansy dust from the gutter passing for good writing. This only spurred them to read more and talk about it more, write more. Unforgettable as his verse, each thought. To himself, when the American entered the living room, a compact beauty, tea-brown, highbrow, capped by wavy black hair. After receiving his drink, he stood at the center of their circle, smile flashing. Each was vying to get his attention. To their surprise, he spoke decent, vigorous Spanish in his soft, melodic voice. All strained to hear him, maybe he was a Veracruzano who had grown up among gringos, a Mexican as the new star of American Negro literature. Someone whispered this in laughter. He mentioned his friend, Carlos Fernandez de Castro, the Cuban writer. Carlos corrected that he was from Missouri, wherever that was. His father, he told them, had managed an electric plant, run a ranch in Toluca. He had spent part of his adolescent years here. He had come to wrap up the estate. He was staying with family friends on the Calle de Elefanto. Though grieving, he still appeared gay. Something nevertheless held in reserve by that insistent grin. So as not to keep him standing, Agustin invited him to sit. The American recited lines by Lopez Velarde and Jimenez as he walked to the couch. They scrambled to places beside him. Agustin, as usual, slung his leg up over the easy chair's arm to show off his ample package. Roberto, who already had a boyfriend, nevertheless daintily perched on the edge of his seat. Antonieta, the lone woman among them, took it all in stride. He winked at her several times as he spoke, and she leaned forward too. His English name was not so easy to pronounce. Longstone is how they all kept saying it. He had no problem with any of theirs, forgetting not a single one. Complimenting the German on the furniture, his modern taste, he, Javier, sipped his punch and observed those lips polishing each syllable, the nasturtium, rose incarnate of that mouth. He hated comparing things to flowers, but in that moment there was no other metaphor. The houseboy brought in canapes and nuts, and the American's eyes trailed his low, broad shoulders. Aha, some of them thought, campesinos are what he goes for. The German could unrefine his touch as needed. He unbuttoned his shirt collar, his fingers combing his chest. The poet offered his observations of the city's literary scene. Who, he asked, were the politically radical, the experimental writers? He spoke of the visual arts, his love of bullfighting, y los novilleros. He beamed a smile which made them all smile more. That's what he likes, the fighting daredevils. They were going to take him to a party at a painter's house. He agreed, and after several more rounds of drinks, they headed out, the German's hand on the American's waist, Elias's clasping his left elbow. He, Javier, followed a few steps behind, chatting with Antonieta, studying the visitor's solid back, ample buttocks. They piled into 2 cars, sped through the night to the painter's house. After 5 knocks, the man with the scar from his right eye to his chin ushered them in. A cross-dresser emerged from a stairwell, her conversation in mid-sentence. He, Javier, had another drink and then another. A man named Rodolfo he had never met before, whispering something into his ear. The American disappeared into the darkness, and suddenly Longstone is at Javier's side, smiling, saying, "I will be staying in the city for a little while longer." Javier mentioning his fellowship to study drama at Yale. "If you get to New York, send word. We'll meet up in Harlem." He gives him several contacts in order to reach him. Before Javier can answer, a bullfighter's expert hand speared the visitor's arm from behind, his eyes saying, "This one is mine tonight." The 2 of them gliding away into the writhing hive. He sent a telegram from New Haven to the address on St. Nicholas Avenue where Langston was staying. He had heard through the grapevine about the Guggenheim, the journey out to Los Angeles to write scripts. He jots in his notebook that he enjoyed the train ride down along the coast. He sat on the south side as his classmate had recommended, observing the scenery of autumnal New York Sound. The water indifferent in its blue undulations, vanishing intermittently behind screens of greening trees and warehouses. He slipped down for the holiday the Americans celebrate to honor the Genoese Columbus. He would miss a single lecture, but will be able to catch at least a weekend matinee. He has told no one, though he may send Salvador and Elias each a letter. He paused to photograph the great vault of Grand Central Terminal. From the taxi to the New Yorker hotel, he stared up into the midday sky. The height of the towers astonished him. He imagined the shadows sleeping in the caverns between them. The pace, still more fervid than Mexico City at lunchtime. All the colors of these people, their vivid, hungry faces. Some made him forget there was a depression. Others' eyes scored their suffering right into him. He saw through to their inner solitude. "You should not stay up in Harlem," a friend had written. "They rioted in March," another warned, attacking every white person. Another said it was fine. "Spend a night at the Teresa. No problems for Mexicans, but Negroes are forbidden there." He wanted to explore that in other neighborhoods. Perhaps he would venture up there even before meeting with Langston. After a nap that first evening, he wandered the streets, then took the subway down to the West Village, ambling slowly around Washington Square, avoiding the beggars, cars, and buses. He happened upon the Italian district, a meal of pasta with red wine. In a little tavern, he downed a few drinks, his eyes lingering on the men, but he said nothing. No one to help him relieve his loneliness. He knew there were places nearby, a bottle of whiskey and a pack of cigarettes. He retraced his steps back to Times Square. The doorman's gaze tracking him inside, he sat at his desk and worked on several drafts of poems, smoking a cigarette. He penned a new one. Then the meal and train ride hit him, and he lay down, stretched across his bed atop the covers, studying the sliver of midnight sky, scarred with stars. He wondered how well or if the poet even remembered him. No message at the front desk. He will call the number he has tomorrow. Friends had sent him the names of several countrymen and other Latin Americans to meet. New Yale friends provided him with others. There are other writers he would love to encounter. His intention during his return after the new year. He thinks of Salvador, of his Agustin, Lasso, not the German, and falls fast asleep. He peers at the telegram and tries to recall. The poet's face remains an empty screen. He met so many people in Mexico City. He should consult his notebooks, carbons. So much he will never put into print, he ponders. Which one could this one be? The party after Rafael's at that apartment, not the movie director, not Salvador, but Javier. Quickly they loom into view, the immense eyes, hawkish nose, wide mouth, glass vase complexion, a tiny beautiful thing, almost passerine. He is trying to figure out if he will even have a minute to respond. Should he call anyone else or meet this man alone? The premiere of the play is just over a week away. Everything that could go wrong already has because of the rich au fait producer-director whose changes have warped his vision into something monstrous, a mess on stage, who keeps demanding more of his royalties, silence from his drama agent Rumsey, despite his constant appeals. Maybe he should let Max handle this too. He sips his coffee and smiles at Toy, his second mother, M, his father. His own mother sent a brief letter from Cleveland wishing him well, but sincerity and false confidence as evident as her shaky hand. The tumor cannibalizing her insides. How can he be there and here? Always the need for more cash. How can he even think to write that novel? Poems keep grinding themselves out of him. The trip to Minnesota days ago feels like it took place last century. All those students cheering at his words. How to bring that world more frequently into view. Maybe he has mixed this poet up with someone else. So many there, such beauty. If only he had a beauty now to listen to him, lean on, lie beside him as he slept. Black, Mexican, it wouldn't matter. The sun crept in, though he had only just halted a nightmare. The cast on stage performing and the theater empty. Jones refusing altogether to pay him. Critics writing reviews condemning the language and structure. He could use the air and light of Central Avenue now, the beach and orange groves, those California Negroes. Even the tenements and sing-song patter of his Cleveland and Chicago neighbors. He hugs Toy goodbye and heads out. More battles at the theater await him. He knots his scarf against the October chill, feels a telegram folded into fourths atop, cards in his jacket pocket. The subway platform not so busy at midday, the train whining its swift approach. He finds a seat in the middle of the car, exchanges glances with the silver-haired man who winks slyly. Shall I make a record of your beauty? He extracts a poem tucked inside the script from his portfolio, uncaps his pen, begins to mark it up. He realizes only as the train slumbers into 34th Street that he has missed his stop. He spent all of yesterday touring Manhattan. First thing after breakfast, the ultra-modern Chrysler Building and the Empire State Fortress, both a brisk stroll from the hotel, the independent subway line to Bookstore Row in the Village, Wall Street, Bowling Green, the aquarium at the little fort at the island's southern tip. He walked to the foot of Brooklyn Bridge, imagining Crane's Steps, Whitman's ferry crossing, rang his hotel from a nearby booth to find out if anyone had rung him. A cab then trained to the public library's main branch on Fifth Avenue, trekked up to St. Patrick's Cathedral, Rockefeller Center, snapped photos, ate a late lunch at an automat, sipping a cola and polishing off a bowl of soda crackers and chicken noodle soup. Watching the patricians and penniless stream past the window, on the street he struck up a conversation with a Puerto Rican who gave the names of restaurants to visit in East Harlem, a walk east to Madison's haberdasher shops where he bought handkerchiefs and a scarf, and the Interborough up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He could only manage the exhibit of Hogarth's prints. So exhausted, he stumbled out into the violet street. No time left to visit Harlem, no messages waiting at his return. In the hotel lobby, he called a painter friend of Carlos's to meet for a meal tomorrow. He had dinner in his room, began reading through his gathering poems. He penned a letter to Salvador, but crumpled it, thought he might see what lurked out in the darkness, signs, stars, blue tattooed letters. But slumber gripped him and he was out. He returned to his hotel after leaving the chatty Guadalajaran and a Broadway matinee of Porgy and Bess. He was searching for the right words to describe it. The songs kept pealing inside, deep inside him. Silence, vast and frozen. A message from Langston awaited. Querido Javier, ¿desea cenar conmigo esta noche? He called the number and a woman answered. She would pass on his message for this evening at 7:30 p.m. He set the clock and lay down. At 7, he rose and washed up, changed into fresh underwear, shirt, the socks he had hung to dry, a pale lavender tie purchased in a store on College Street. At 7:25, he headed downstairs, expecting to see the American standing there. He sat in a comfortable chair and waited. He had brought a copy of Maeterlinck's poems. He flipped through, barely reading, as his watch hand spun. At 8:04, Langston walked in, palms extended in greeting, his face gay and fuller, sporting a mustache. He spoke in Spanish, almost formally at first. Javier replied in casual English, apologies upon apologies. There were issues at the theater, a dramatic piece beginning in a week. Too much to explain right now. Did the visitor want to dine at the hotel, go downtown to the village? Javier suggested Harlem. Langston mentioned it was 60 blocks north, but they could take the train. There were restaurants still open. He had one in mind in particular if Javier was game. The visitor urged that they take a taxi cab. He had a little stipend. He would pick up the fare. The doorman hailed one for them. They climbed in and pitched right into conversation. Langston asking about the various people he had met last spring, the writers, painters, theater, the social and political conditions in Mexico. He offered some gossip about the celebrities he met in Los Angeles and during his stay in Carmel, like the heartthrob Ramon Navarro. Javier describes the experience of Gershwin's musical. He is one of America's finest composers, Langston says. Not a colored man, but he has something of us in his soul. In no time, they reach Harlem, where the buildings shrink and the faces brown. At Robert Johnson's Dixie on 133rd Street, they climb out. Langston leads his guests into the mid-sized restaurant. They cut up in here, he laughs, and I mean cut up. Javier doesn't understand the idiom, but laughs too. A fox-faced maitre d' ushers them to a table. The dining space is not especially full, but all there are, Javier notes, are black people. No one gives him more than a glance, though several greet Langston. I have to be on my best behavior, he whispers, grinning, though you can get away with quite a bit in here. Javier again fails to grasp what he means, but savors that smile. The wall of reserve he observed in Mexico has fallen, a bandstand empty, but some instruments hunkers off to the side. I was trying to think of all the people I want to meet you, but I've been so busy with this play and all. It is a budding disaster, not that that matters. It's on Broadway, Javier asks. Yes, at the Vanderbilt. It's called Mulatto. Like your poem, quote, into my father's heart to plunge the knife to gain the utmost freedom that is life. Yes, though there's a fuller story, actors, the whole deal. I'm sure it is brilliant, and I hope to see it. If you only knew what they were doing to it. But let's talk about something else, like your studies at Yale. They chat about Javier's classes, his desire not just to write, but understand the theory of theater, to know drama's extensive history. Do they teach you about rich, white Southern dictators who fancy themselves the producer-directors? Javier's not sure exactly what or whom Langston means. Is this the father he wrote the poem about? He notices two Fey men at a table, observing them. Yale is one of the most elite schools, Langston continues. They make sure not to let many, really any, Negroes in. Unsure what to say, Javier sips his water. At another table, he spots a woman's leg rising along the line of her table partner, another woman. The waiter glides up to take their order. A minute more to choose, please. Javier asks questions about Harlem, when he'll be returning to Mexico. Langston promises a tour and the rest of the city when Javier comes back. The drinks and the main dishes arrive. The meal is passable, but there's the ambiance. All the restaurants, like the people up here, are suffering badly. Javier nods, affirming things are tough in Mexico City too. We're still waiting, Langston adds, on President Roosevelt to help us, and I mean us. We'll even take President Cardenas if he isn't too busy. Both laugh and launch into a discussion of poetry. The poets of Mexico first, Langston lists all he knows: Cuesta, Gorostiza, Torres Bodet, Ortiz de Montellano. Then other poets leaving their mark in the Spanish language: Darío, Vallejo, Guillén. The Chileans, Mistral and Neruda, especially the ones committed to the cause of political, economic, and social liberation. The contemporaneos are not communists, Javier responds, but are quietly striving to transform Mexican literature. What does he think of Borges? Langston asks. The avant-garde without a political compass can easily become reactionary. Javier assures him there is no danger of this among his group. You must read Alfonso Reyes, Gutierrez Cruz. What are the poets of Harlem, of America? He has heard of some of the names, but not many others. Cullen, yes, a master stylist. Douglas Johnson, the powerful Mackay. Nugent, never heard of him. Bontemps, no. Grimke, Walrond, Brown. He withdraws a little notebook and his fountain pen. He has to ask Langston to repeat a number of them. Then the white ones. Crane. Why, of course, Crane came to Mexico a few years ago. Eliot, certainly so erudite and forbidding. Pound, Williams, he's familiar with these. Yes, and Bennett, Sandberg, Robinson, Millay. Stevens? No. Moore? No. HD? No. Most are politically retrograde. The whole passel, including Hillier, Coffin, as well as the Southern agrarians, though Ransom is a good poet, and the rest not worth mentioning. There are poets with far better politics, like Fearing, Rukeyser, Davidman, Beecher. Does he know any American poets who are of Mexican descent or write in Spanish? He will send Javier some of the issues of the newer periodicals he has appeared in. They talk of Gide, Wilde, Proust. Through their ideas of poetry, what makes it so necessary always, especially now, even more than novels or essays. Like plays, it is, Langston says, an immediate and economical way of reaching the masses, promoting the ideas that will foster and allow revolution to flourish in society. Look at the bloody lesson of Mexico, Javier says. One should exercise caution when invoking that term. He views poetry's role in power as more modest. Poetic language always carries the seed of something revolutionary, merely by being a testimony to one's always complex and difficult interior journeys. In language, you need to lose yourself to recover yourself. Yes, Langston says, that too, so true. Still talking, they finish dinner, another round of drinks. Javier mentions an early train back to New Haven. Over Langston's general objections, he pays the bill. The male couple, now openly holding hands at their table, offer familial approval. We are not afraid of the night. The next one will be my treat. They walk down to 125th Street to hail a taxi, shoulder to shoulder, fingers grazing. Javier offers to have the cab drop him off, and then abruptly says, why don't you come back downtown with me, have a final nightcap and relax. Langston muses a second and then agrees. There are places in Times Square where we can get a drink. I have a bottle of whiskey in my room. The taxi knifes through the city's dark canyons, the sky glowing blue as a gas flame. Javier presses his thigh into Langston's. They are discussing the options of nightlife. If this were a Saturday, I would have many places to take you. No bullfighters, but we have some things almost as delectable. Javier laughs and says, not everyone longs for a brute. Yes, Langston answers, a poet's touch can do the trick. The taxi lets him off right in front of the hotel. In the room, Javier takes Langston's hat, coat, and scarf. He glimpses himself in the mirror, more cold, more fire. Pours each a little glass full. They sip in silence for a while. Langston inspects the room, the neatly folded clothes, small pile of books, the sheaf of poems. Javier asks Langston if he is keeping him from anyone. No luck in that regard, he responds. They pour through my fingers like water. Ferdinand, AC. So beautiful, Javier says to himself, it seems incomprehensible. And you, I imagine you have someone back in Mexico City or someone new up in New Haven. There is a novio at home, but things are complicated. Always, Langston says, the toll you pay for your art. He sits down at the desk. Please don't read those poems. They aren't ready. Ah, but this one is a gem. Somnambulant, asleep and awakened all at once. In silence I roam the submerged city. That one is called Nocturnal Estancias, Nocturnal Ranches and Stanzas. How intriguing. I think my whole next book will be a volume of nocturnes. That is where I truly live. Javier pours each another drink, takes off his tie and jacket. ¿Está cansado? Sí, un poco. It is getting late, Langston says. You have an early train and I a long trip back uptown. Please, no hurry, finish your drink. Langston knocks it back. Thank you for a wonderful evening. Thank you, and I will be your Virgil through the city next time. Javier passes him his hat and coat. They embrace, peck each other's cheek. He departs. Javier slips out of his remaining clothes, packs, sets the alarm clock. He notices Langston's scarf is still in the chair. He will mail it to the Emersons when he reaches New Haven. He finishes off a cigarette, reads one of his poems, not so bad, but not yet as good as he wants it, climbs into bed, douses the light. There is a knock at the door. He listens, ignores it. It persists. He rises, cracks it open. I'm sorry, Javier, but I left my scarf here, I think. Please come in. It's just over there. Langston enters. He does not light the lamp. He wants to say something, nothing to be said. Let hunger and instinct guide them in this confusion of bodies. He will show this one is mine. Slides Langston's coat from his shoulders, the jacket, tie, underpants, shoes, his lips on his lips, their bodies bare together, his chest on his, armpits and thighs. He guides his hand down there. He kneels and tastes his hard sex of salt silkiness. He guides him to the bed. They caress and kiss. This mouth is mine. He climbs atop him, dulce, tan dulce, tastes his salt again, takes his sex again, in that blue darkness, spin his sweat, satin funk and musk sweetens his tongue opening. He takes cement dulce, slowly, again a double death, ay morenito, this mouth is his, sweetly mi angel, fills him, the firm grip on his hips, nipples, ankles, fast now, angel, more together in sync, this rhythm of men alone together, a blues fills them, he feels him deep inside his soul, ay negrito moans, this man is mi amor, short breaths, as one together, sweet fire, ay cariño, they come to this, yes, this fire together, cries, si, este fuego, si, softly, softly, they lie beside each other, in the crepuscular dark, holding tight, night pouring in to stir the blue-black shadows somewhere out there, dawn on the horizon, somewhere out there, dawn, and trains to New Haven, Harlem, the open grave of life, this dying room, its waning song. Will you write a poem about tonight? I already have, and you, I have too. Who will you give it to? You, my angel, and you, my very own, our secret. I loved my friend amid this solitude. Let us roam the night together, loving, living these blues. Thank you.
Well, so first of all, John, I thought that was really wonderful reading. Thank you so much for reading that piece.
Thank you.
As I was listening to it, it really made me think about when I was an undergraduate student in an American Lit survey class. I remember my professor describing Langston Hughes as very asexual, and so so hearing you reading that piece, and then also around that time the film Looking for Langston came out. And so I really love the way that you really dived into the sort of eroticism, the intimacies, the closeness between these two characters. But what I was most interested in, so I knew that the piece was based on North Carolina blues. I wasn't as familiar with Villa Rutia as an artist, but I was curious about why you chose to tell the story from his point of view. particularly because at the start of the story, he's more of a spectator. He's observing Hughes. And if it were me, I thought, well, you know, of all the people, all the artists that I love and admire, I would probably want to imagine myself as them. And so I was curious about why you chose him.
That's a great question. So one thing I'll say, so several things I'll say is, first of all, the form of the poem, it's called a poem, right? The form of the story, right?
It's like
the form of the story, it's like a prose poem. The form of the story is actually taken directly from Richard Bruce Nugent's Smoke, Lords, and James.
Okay.
And sort of unconsciously, what I was thinking about was, you know, kind of all of those absences in Langston Hughes' life. Mm-hmm. I will say that I was actually at a James Baldwin conference a few years ago in France, and I was at this table, and there was a woman sitting across from a professor, and she said, you know, I don't know how we got on Langston Hughes, and she said, you know, and the, you know, the gays just want to take him over. And I'm thinking, okay, first of all, we're at a James Baldwin conference. It's like, what are you talking about the gays for? Well, then I was like, what are you? I was like, you know, what does that even mean? You know, and I challenged her. Said, well, he wasn't gay, you know, because, you know, if you read the Arnold Rampersad biography, blah 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 blah. Okay, and of course, there were a bunch of younger, he was a senior scholar, and a bunch of young scholars were just kind of like, okay, let me just look away. So I was like, I'm not gonna, you know, let this one have this. So I said, well, just so you know, I'm writing a story about Langston Hughes and his, you know, gay experience with, queer experience with Javier Urrutia, and then of course I talked a little bit about that. But then, of course, I said, let me go back and read Rampersad's biography, and let me, you know, also read Hughes's poems, right? And so I actually got, you know, that beautiful, huge volume of Hughes's poetry. And of course, what becomes clear is this is a queer poet, right? Again and again and again. But I should also say that Richard Bruce Nugent's former partner, Tom Worth, who's no longer with us, but who I met, I think in the late 90s, Tom said, oh yes, no, you know, Langston Hughes was gay, whatever. Okay. So anyway, so I said, I want to think about these two major queer modernists, because in that section of the book there's a third who has his own story, Mário de Andrade, the great Brazilian queer modernist. And in the case of all three, their sexuality is both visible and in some official stories, you know, kind of invisible. Urrutia probably the least of the three. But I was really interested in the connection between Hughes and Urrutia and the possibility that at one point they might, or several points they might have met up. So I thought I'll use Nugent's form, right, because it's appropriate to the moment, it's appropriate to the subject matter, but then also to play with perspective, because of course one of the things we learn, you know, you learn in fiction class 101 is, you know, you have to be really careful about point of view. So I really wanted to play with that, and also to sort of think about almost a kind of an approach that would be, you know, would come out of the Harlem Renaissance, like, you know, think about things like Cubism, et cetera, movements of that moment, where this perspective is constantly shifting, so that you're in Urrutia's head and you're in Hughes's head, but you can't always tell, because of course the other thing that the sort of line that I actually collage into the story that is in the Urrutia poem is, and there are many, I should say, many lines collaged in from both Hughes and Urrutia's poetry, is this confusion of bodies, right? So I wanted to think about, to actually kind of embody that in the story itself. So that's why I moved back and forth between their perspectives.
Oh, fascinating, thank you. The other thing I noticed, I mean, that, can everyone hear me up here, by the way? Okay, excellent. So the story is also called Blues, and I imagine, I mean, that's certainly a reference to North Carolina blues, but also Hughes was well known for his blues poetry.
Exactly.
And then I noticed in your work, I saw this in many of your poems, returning to blues, and so I'm just curious about what blues means to you.
I think it's absolutely fundamental. I think it's absolutely fundamental to African American cultural production, you know, of all kinds. It's foundational for Black music, it's foundational for Black literature, it's foundational for Black, I mean, whatever, you know, Black people in the United States do. It's foundational, whether we recognize it or not, right? You know, it's both a visible, and I was saying visible and invisible, visible and an invisible river, to use the term that Kamau Brathwaite used to talk about. And so for me, I wanted to think about, you know, particularly blues in relation to Hughes, him using the form overtly, which was considered radical at the time, but also kind of all the valences of blues, you know. Blues as a color, blues as music, blues as a condition, a mood, and to sort of play that out, right? Because of course part of what's going on here in the story is connection and disconnection, but also he's struggling. I mean, he's on the one hand, you know, he mentions sort of wanted to have, you know, some factual information in there. He actually goes to, at one point he did go to Minnesota. Well, he's going first to LA and, you know, hang out with movie stars, and you know, going to Minnesota, and he's got this crowds of cheering students. But then when he's trying to mount this play on Broadway, you know, he's encountering all these problems with the producer, director, and then also he's got personal problems, like, you know, his mother's dying of cancer. So I wanted to sort of think about blues in a deep sense, and I'm sort of fascinated by the ongoing power of blues as a concept, you know, and as sort of structuring concept, and so it actually sort of makes appearance in all my work in different ways.
Yeah, there's a quote that I remember coming across many years ago about, and I think it was from Hughes, which is the idea that, you know, blues is the things that are deepest in your heart that you want to cry about, but then instead you laugh.
Right, exactly, exactly.
So also in relation to music, I notice you also, the influence of hip hop in your music, and I'm thinking in particular about the piece, I want you to read a little bit for me, actually, but it's the Lakeview poem in Punks. And so when I was reading that poem, the thing, it like really pleased me and excited me when I got the lyrics from Yasin Bey, formerly known as Mos Def. And I want to make sure I say it correctly. So he says, I want black people to be free, to be free. And then what I noticed was the variations on that lyric throughout the entire poem. And what I thought was, so what's most interesting about that poem is the way that it interrogates black spaces, and particularly what like freedom means and what affinities mean and what identity means as a black queer person in those spaces too. And the last stanza, which I'll ask you to read in a little bit, is the one that just really lit me up, because it just, I think the way that it imagines this really fraught space as a place for lots of possibility and creation is really exciting. So if you could read it and maybe talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so the first thing I'll say is I wrote this poem during my very first year in Chicago. I was a visitor at Northwestern in the spring of 2001, and I had a wonderful time, right, as a visitor up at Northwestern. But you know, being in Lakeview, it was kind of a culture shock on a certain level. The neighborhood was, I guess, it's probably still gentrifying, and I felt hostility from, you know, some of the white queer people that I encountered. So, you know, I was feeling homesick, and so I said, I wrote, you know, I wanted to try to put it into words, and you know, one of the ways that poets do that is they pick a form. So I said, I'm going to pick a form that I've never written before, the bop, which was, I think, created at Cave Canem. I want to say Afaa Michael Weaver was the creator, but many Cave Canem poets have come out of Cave Canem, and poets not involved at all in Cave Canem have written bops, and it follows. It has a set of rules, and so one of the poets who, of course, I think, you know, has a series of really beautiful bops. In addition to Afaa, is Lyrae Van Cleef Stefanon. Okay, so the other thing, let me just say this is, so when I was a teenager, hip hop was starting to really become a thing, and I used to listen to a lot of hip hop, you know, and it was wild because, you know, my father loved music, and he, you know, if it was R&B, it was fine. If it was jazz, it was fine. You know, if I was listening to rock music, he would be like, turn that crap off, you know. I mean, if it was like, you know, like the Beatles or something like that, you know, fine. But if it was, because punk rock was still big, and this was the 80s. Punk rock was big, and, you know, then also, I wasn't really into heavy metal, but sometimes just to annoy him, I would turn on heavy metal. But also hip hop, you know, he was like, what are they doing? He's like, why are they, you know, talking? He was like, you know, Lou Rawls used to do that in 1969, and he was great. You know, and my father would listen to, when I was a child, he would put on The Last Poets. We would, you know, would wake up and, you know, on like a Saturday morning, he would have The Last Poets beaming, you know, Gil Scott-Heron, and I'm like, well, basically, there's a like lineage here. Don't you see it? But he just saw it as like, I don't know, this like outrageous young people in horrible outfits, from the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens and wherever. And he was like, I don't want to hear that. Turn that mess off. So anyway, but it seeped into me. And so the weirdest thing is, there are moments there's one story in particular about music and counter narratives where when I read it aloud, I can hear the hip hop rhythms. And it always kind of like freaks me out because it's like, at some deep level, it's, it kind of is like a well that I draw on. So anyway, so here's Lakeview Sojourn. Here's the final two stanzas. So I've learned to thrive on silence, exile, cunning, putting, surviving, fashioning my own spaces, places, nurturing passions I live and own and passing them on, remaining open, imagining possibilities that free us, nexuses where all my families connect, dialogue and respect, where no one mans the barricades and chords from every singer conjure, our common futures from forgotten words. I want black people to be free, to be free. Yeah, I love that song.
I could hear it.
Yeah. It's such a beautiful song, Umi says. Yeah.
And it's a really fantastic song also just because of the way that it merges all these different genres of music.
Yeah.
But when you were speaking and you talked about your father and like poetry and music, it made me think of a conversation so the poet slash essayist slash musician, Randall Horton, I remember him, he had like a social media post where he kind of went off and he was just like, he always gets these comparisons to rap music with his work, his poetry. And he is, I think, one of the few people that I know who makes a very sharp distinction between the lyric and poetry and how the lyric, functions in music. So I'm curious, do you see I'm sure that there are overlaps, but do you see fundamental differences in the way that poetry, the lyric functions or operates in poetry as opposed to music? Or is there something, there's a kind of merging or marriage between those two that's really...
I think it depends on the performer, the musician, and the actual lyrics, the rap lyrics. Some people are, because some rappers started off with, sort of non-musical accompaniment, freestyling, right? And just can go. I mean, that to me is really, amazing. Speaking of Mos Def, Yasin Bey, there was years ago in this Chappelle show, there was this. I have this clip. I found the clip online when you could still do that before everything was put on lockdown, where he just freestyles and it's extraordinary. But it's poetry. That also reminds me. So when I was at Northwestern, I was part of an organization called the Poetry and Poetics Colloquium. And we had a scholar from the University of Virginia come and talk, and he gave this fascinating talk on non-poetic discourses in poetry, right? So how people are utilizing non-poetic discourses to expand the possibilities of poetic language. But he was also talking about, uses of sound, etc. And one of my very sort of conservative senior colleagues sort of turns around to me and says, well, rap music is poetry. And I almost fell out of my chair because I was like, oh my God, this is one of the last people that I would ever expect to acknowledge that, right? But of course, as we know, I mean, music lyrics are, can be and often are poetry, right? I mean, sometimes they're bad poetry, right? And the music is what elevates them, but some of them they're extraordinary poetry and can stand on their own, And I try to be sort of open to that and think about like the ways in which people sort of coming from different places are speaking to each other. So for example, I think about like the number of people who have been interested in hip hop and also spoken word poetry, right? And there was a long period where people wanted to bracket spoken word poetry off from everything else, and it's like, what are you talking about? I mean, because there's something to be said for what spoken word poets do. But moving from the stage to the page is also a kind of interesting thing to think about. So to me, I see it, everything is part of a large family, and I don't want to kind of leave one off, or out. Yeah,
I agree. They're siblings.
Right, exactly.
So, I know that we are running short on time, and I do want to leave time for audience questions. So I have, one last question to ask you. I have so many questions here, but so this is a long question, and it's got lots of levels of questions, so that should hopefully give you time to think a little bit about the question that you might have to ask John. In counter narratives, I have a couple of favorites. So one of my favorites is the story, an outtake from the ideological origins of the American Revolution. I think that it's a really fascinating work, and it's part of this longer tradition of works that use the experiences of slavery to kind of explore different discourses of Black intellectual thought, and specifically thinking about what enslavement means, what freedom means, all those different concepts. The concept in particular that I was interested in when I read this story was the concept of like the black social death as opposed to social life.
Right.
And then this character Zion, who I think is, so Zion is this character he's an enslaved man who repeatedly runs away throughout the story, and he keeps getting captured and brought back. But when he runs away, I mean, like, I'm disappointed because I'm hoping he'll be like Harriet Tubman and save people and bring them back. But he like engages in all kinds of debauchery, including rape, right? So it's actually quite serious too. So, you know, my first feeling is like this desire to condemn him, right? But the other side of it is I can't condemn him, right? Because he doesn't have legal personhood.
Right.
And so therefore, you cannot commit a crime, you know, if you don't have personhood.
Right.
And so I think about it in the space of social death and social life, that he kind of operates as a sort of social boogeyman, because he kind of haunts these concepts, these larger concepts of liberation and freedom. Running parallel in the story is also the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. And at the very end of the story, there's a point when he escapes again. He escapes hanging.
Right.
And when he escapes hanging, at the same time, the Declaration of Independence is produced, and we actually see the image of that as well in the story.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, I mean, my first question connected to that is, I'm thinking like, what was like Zion's understanding of freedom within this like really, you know, fraught space, especially around his identity, and then also just like that parallel with America's, you know, freedom also, and your use of that text, which I thought was incredibly powerful.
Well, it's an excellent question, and so I will say several things motivated that story. One was, of course, thinking about Bernard Bailyn's famous, because the title refers directly to the ideological origins of the American Revolution, which is a fascinating text. I think won the Pulitzer Prize, and he's talking about you know, the colonists, the British colonists' desire for freedom, and really sort of, you know, what motivated them, and he kind of overturns sort of pre-existing understanding of that, right? But of course, what's fascinating is, in so many of these texts like his, there are no, you know, there's almost no mention of Black people. And when you look at the, you know, American Revolution, you know, and when John Adams is defending the British soldiers, I believe I have this correct, and he gives that famous peroration, you know, he just delineates all the people involved, and he says, you know, this collection of, you know, Negroes, or mulattoes, Negroes, you know, Irish Jack Tars, and this whole group, you know, just basically like all the people at the absolute, you know, bottom of society are here, you know, creating havoc. And, you know, of course, as we know, Crispus Attucks, who was Black/mixed race, was the first person killed in the American Revolution. So all of this is sort of elided, right? So I was interested in sort of excavating something out of that text, but also thinking of another text that was very important to me was Lorenzo Johnston Green's very famous text, The Negro in Colonial New England, where he basically, you know, kind of reinserts Black people into the narrative of New England, particularly to talk about slavery, right? I mean, one of the things he points out again and again is that, you know, every New England state that existed had slavery. Some, many more, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, some very few, particularly New Hampshire, but that they were enslaved people from the very beginning, right? And so he wants to rethink that history. So I was sort of thinking about kind of that clash, and also thinking about all of this rhetoric of liberty, right? This kind of radical liberty. What might that look like embodied in someone who is socially, on the one level, socially dead, who is so radically unfree, but embodies radical freedom? Yeah. Because so much of what he does parallels what his educated master does, right? except that his master, his behavior and actions are legitimated, right? Okay. And of course, his master, of course, is going to then go on and, as I suggest, fight against the British, right? And so the other thing I was very interested in, and a colleague pointed this out to me, she was like, you have these very interesting lines about, sort of like administrative law in the United States, with early, sort of British colonies, right? Like this tension that's happening. So part of what happens in terms of his hanging is that Britain is attempting to make an example of this British colony, but they're going to use the body of a black person, right? So I was interested in all those things, and so I wanted him to also be an anti-hero, to not be, this wonderful person. I mean, I had a colleague say to me, John, I love this story, but why is he bad? Why can't he just be good? And I was like, because, I wanted there to be complexity. So, but yeah, the great question.
I mean, he stays with you as a character for sure.
Yeah.
So, this is probably a good point to turn it over to the audience. Do you have any questions for John?
Maybe I'll climb the pump. I've got questions for you all night, John, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about footnotes. And, in reading counter-narratives, I kept thinking about, well, you were talking about the blues, the genesis of the blues story is kind of coming out of what sounded like a footnote, speculating on a line of Viotia's. And it feels to me like, your work, the title of Annotations, but also so much of the work in counter-narratives that comes out of research and ferreting out kind of, the little stories that don't get into the master narrative. I keep thinking about footnotes when I read your work, and all the different things footnotes do, right? So they can just be attributions of sources, right? But they can also be like little moments of speculation, or things that you can fit, and then sometimes I think they're too unruly to fit into even self-doubt. So I'm just wondering if you.
That's a great question. So I will say, at one point I was thinking actually of doing a book called Footnotes. I'm sure someone has already done that. And I will say with, when it came to, I believe with annotations there was not an issue, but with counter narratives, my editor said, John, this sounds so academic, people will just walk right past it, they won't know it's, stories and fiction. So I said, okay, let's put stories and fiction on it, so they'll know. But on another level, right, that's a great question to think about, what a footnote does and what does it mean to annotate things, or what does it mean to, and I think we'll probably discuss this a little bit on Saturday, in terms of thinking about the archive and drawing upon the archive, right? What kind of work can you do, particularly in fiction or poetry? I mean, I have some poems in Punks that actually look at history, and sort of, but in a much more compressed form. So there's a poem, for example, on Elaine Locke. There's a poem about Benjamin Banneker. Some figures of Denmark Vesey, Bessie Smith. So, what can you do with the form of the footnote? I will say that I had reached a certain point where, when I was teaching, I would always have students say to me, "Oh, Professor, I love David Foster Wallace. I love David Foster Wallace. Oh my God, can we read David Foster Wallace?" Right? And I would be like, "Oh my God, really?" And the footnotes, and look, the man is a very, a talented writer, and some of his work is absolutely brilliant. But at a certain point, I felt like a gimmick. But then I thought, okay, but what would it mean? And this is not a criticism of him, but what would it mean if the footnote becomes, if not just the form, but the very sort of concept of the footnote becomes a way into a story? So the longest story, novella, actually, in counter narratives is based on a footnote, because I was thinking, so many of these stories are, in a way, like footnotes or outtakes to this larger history. And one of the things that, I've taught one of the halves of Intro to, well, now Africana Studies, but Intro to African American Studies. One of the things that always fascinates me is when I teach a course like that, the number of students who say to me, oh, I thought I knew about the Civil War. Oh, I thought I knew about Reconstruction. Or, oh, I thought I knew about, Jim Crow. Or, oh, I thought I knew about, desegregation. And then, we read these documents, like primary documents. We read accounts and things that we read, works of imaginative art and imaginative literature. And they are just astonished, right? Because they're like, oh, well, why was this left out? And why was this left out? And why was this story left out? And you see that the portrait is, the picture is so much vaster and richer and deeper and more complex, right? So I thought, what about little moments, right, from that vaster, richer story? And here it is hemispheric. So it's not just the United States. It also, of course, as we heard, one of the stories is set partly in Mexico, Dominican Republic, Brazil. I'm trying to think of where. There are a number of places, right, all over the U.S., right, because I wanted to really kind of open up what might feel like a footnote, but not have it be so academic, right? To have, for example, some of these stories, something really thrilling, so that you really were kind of, on the edge of your seat trying to figure out what was going to happen, even as you are getting, kind of the story expanded and expanded and expanded and expanded. So.
So I think two of the things that I'm really interested in your work is thinking about diaspora and how anachronistic the stories are. And I'm wondering if this idea of omission and footnotes and how footnotes themselves can serve as a way of marking what is being erased. How is it that you are always contemplating about diaspora within these very vast multitudes of blackness and thinking about the times in which that exists and how it can be brought to the present in your way of writing?
Oh, that's a great question. It's tough too, because, I try to think about diaspora with complexity. I've had over the years so many colleagues who have really written about diaspora and talked about it with incredible nuance. And so one of the things I want to try always to do as a writer is not to flatten out things, right? Which means that sometimes I have to struggle to understand, to figure out like how I can actually make sense of the world I'm trying to put on the page. To give you just one example, in this in counter narratives, there's a story called The Lions, right? And people have said, oh, it's so negative, and it's, why would you end that way? And it is a particularly difficult and horrifying story on a certain level. But I was really interested in, when I was thinking about that story and writing that story, this is going to sound wild. When I was younger, I remember I would go to events in New York, and there were always, some of these sort of very radical, people have been very radical, like sometimes separatists, et cetera, from people from Brooklyn, people from Harlem, et cetera. And, they praise people like Robert Mugabe, right? I'm like, okay, well, Robert Mugabe, like, let's, okay, yeah. He got rid of the British, but he's not such a great guy. So I said, but let me go read Mugabe's speeches. And one of the things I was fascinated by was, first of all, his skill as a writer, but also the use of rhetoric and how, all these things that he's saying are kind of end up being turned upside down. So in thinking about that, I thought, okay, on the one hand, this is a very dangerous story for me to be writing. I probably should not be writing this. On the other hand, I wanted to think that through. I wanted to think through, like, what might it be like to get into the head of two people, one of whom is a very sort of Mugabe-esque person, and the other one who is, basically who has felt so betrayed by the betrayals, right? And by all of this, both the use of revolutionary discourse, but also by the use of, as I sort of try to make clear in the story, by then, also turning to, kind of liberal discourse, right, and neoliberal discourse, right, all in the service of just sort of enriching himself and his family and whatever. So what might that look like? So in thinking about that, I mean, I realized I had to be very careful how I proceeded, and to think about, as you mentioned, time, because time comes up again, time comes up a lot in that story. Thinking about time, thinking about diaspora, thinking about, who my audience was, sort of who I envisioned my audience was, how it might be received, and then just daring myself to go there. So.
Time maybe for one more question?
Can you talk a bit about genre and how you either choose the genre for a subject or what subjects lend themselves to picking or deciding whether you're writing prose or...
Oh, that's great. That's an excellent question. So I've told people before, when I was younger, like everything began as a poem. I saw everything as a poem, and I would put, no matter what it was, I thought it was a poem. And then, I reached a certain age, probably when I was in junior high or high school, I realized, you also are interested in things that are much longer and expansive. So, I began to realize that's probably more in the vein of fiction. I think usually one of the things that I tell my students is, scale and expansiveness are crucial when you're thinking about what it is you're doing. I mean, if it's a story, really a story, then it's going to either be a story or a novel. If it is a moment, an idea, a feeling, then it usually is a poem. I see them in conversation with each other. There was this someone made a comment on Twitter that said, something along the lines of, many novelists are horrible poets, but all poets write great prose, right? And I thought, okay, what is this? And of course, this, some people, they came forward and they said, well, what about Hardy, and what about, this name certain people, and then, of course, other people, of course, almost everyone they cited was European American writer or European writer. But then other people got really enraged by this, and someone was just like, of course, it turned into like this really crazy hate rant, and I was like, people, I mean, it's not that serious, It's just one person's opinion. Calm down, But I do think, when I'm thinking about myself, one of the things I will say about many poets I know is that people who write poetry almost exclusively, is they think in terms of a particular project, and they think about, what are the poems, or a series of poems that are going to fulfill that project, right? Even if they don't call it a project, right? Or they write poems and they realize these poems are speaking to each other. And most of the people I know who exclusively write, novels think, I'm going to write a novel, right? I'm going to write a novel and blah, blah, blah. And the people I know who do novels and short stories or primarily write short stories are somewhere in between, right? They're thinking of moments, they're thinking of a sliver of a life, and that becomes a short story. So I think, I have these ideas in my head about like where things are going and try to follow them. And one of the things that, with Punks that was sort of interesting to me was when I went back and looked at the manuscript, I was kind of surprised at the range of forms that I use. But then the other thing I was saying was I try to give myself the freedom to do that. So at one point, I usually don't write poems that are, just like each line is a full sentence. But I said, okay, do that, try that, see what happens. The only thing that can happen is, you fail or you succeed, right? It works or it doesn't work, right? And if it doesn't work, you've learned something, and try it again or try something else, so.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.